Looking at our definition of IMF, we talked about the creation of high-quality master versions called compositions. This is exactly what the word format in IMF relates to, a composition. A composition can be defined as a collection of assets constructed of media and data essence types which, when given temporal structure, make up a single version of a program. The versions we mentioned can be anything from alternate languages, different editorial cuts of the works, be it for a specific target distribution platform such as an airline or hotel group, and also rights management and censor cuts based on religious or cultural reasons. IMF is not designed for the consumer. It is a business-to-business format with a purpose in aiding the efficiencies in the interchange of file-based transmissions, amongst other benefits which we will cover later. Today, IMF is primarily used in two categories, as a distribution service master and as an archival master. There are varying kinds of compositions, which tells a system on how to categorize the content of the composition. These content kind identifiers can be an advertisement, feature, short, teaser, trailer, all the way up to a supplemental, which indicates behind the scenes footage, deleted scenes, etc. So we've briefly gone through a composition and what it entails. And yes, like every other format, it is made up of file types. However, there is one very noticeable difference, and that is that IMF is not reliant upon file names of its track file assets in order to utilize them in playback. So, those long-winded naming conventions that everyone has grown to know and love over the years, they can be put to rest. Instead, IMF uses identifier numbers to identify assets, more reasonably an asset ID. Each individual asset in a composition, regardless of its type, is required to have an asset ID. Each asset has a uniform resource name that is the unique material ID of that asset, commonly referred to as the asset ID. The asset identity ID is in the form of a universal unique ID. UUIDs are used across the IMF framework extensively, not only to identify assets, but also to link metadata objects and other related characteristics across a composition and throughout the file system to which the assets reside. It will be presented to you in an XML document as follows, and the human readable UMID value from an MXF track file should be presented to you like this. But surely, the file has a file name. How does this work? How does a composition know what is what? You are correct, and there is an answer as to how a system knows what the asset ID of a file is, but more on this later, as explaining this process now may add to confusion. Also, speaking of MXF track files, this will make more sense when we cover that topic shortly. But first, on to essence types. IMF has three essence types: image, audio, and data, all of which have base characteristics constrained in this 2067-2 core constraints standard. Image characteristics such as the image type, frame size, frames per second, etc. are further governed by a suite of constraints known as applications. Audio is too referenced by the respective applications, but its general use today is uncompressed PCM 24-bit WAV. Data refers both to time text and metadata essence. In IMF, time text is primarily represented by a format known as IMSC1. IMSC1 is an extension profile which constrains the use of the time text markup language format, both of which have been published as recommendations by the World Wide Web Consortium. It has two profiles associated with it, text and image. IMSC boasts a rich feature set aiding time text workflows and greatly benefits both the creative and technical communities alike in the representation of subtitles and captions. As of the publication date for this tutorial work, the current version is IMSC 1.1. It is important to note that generally speaking, when someone refers to essence, they will refer to it by its essence type. Metadata can be a very broad term with varying definitions on the subject depending upon the context in which it is referenced. For the sake of keeping things simple, one can describe it as it being the interconnecting informational glue within the IMF framework that binds together and makes sense of all file formats, essence, and data types. So for the sake of IMF, I'm going to break it down into 5 subcategories: static, dynamic, descriptive, reference, and administrative. These subcategories can be subjective depending on who is explaining the concept to you and will vary from implementation to implementation, but for the sake of this instructional series, we will stick with these terms. The most common metadata type found in IMF is descriptive metadata. Descriptive metadata is metadata that describes resources for the purpose of identification and compliance. It is embedded within files, for example MXF, and is applicable to pretty much every file type within the IMF framework. Next up is both static and dynamic metadata. This drives the characteristics to which an essence type should be correctly rendered. The most common use case is with high dynamic range imagery, most notably Dolby Vision, in which dynamic metadata allows a compatible display to tone map the HDR content to a smaller color volume only as needed when the content exceeds the capability of the playback display itself. Once again, for the sake of following along, I'm going to car park both reference and administrative metadata types here, as it will make more sense later when I talk about the relevant files which leverage these metadata types.